Great, thanks, Conti. And good afternoon, everyone. I am Christina Henderson, Chair of the Transportation Planning Board this year, and I'm calling this October 2024 virtual meeting of the TPB to order. Hopefully you all are able to see and hear me. Excuse me, if you have any issues with your audio or video connection during this meeting, you can shoot an email to Conti or Lynn and they'll help you try to proceed. But before we proceed with the meeting, which is completely virtual this evening, this afternoon, as well as being aired on TPB's YouTube channel, I'm going to just share a little bit about how we're going to proceed. So we'll first start with a roll call, and then after that, we will have our comments from the public. During the meeting on agenda items where we need to adopt a resolution, we'll first have the presenters present their briefing, and then I'll make a motion to adopt the resolution, then invite a second. We'll ask some questions and then we'll take the roll. Just for folks who might be joining us for the first time, when folks are voting, we'll only be calling for the nays and abstentions. So we'll take your quiet as a yes vote. Members, when you wish to speak, just use the raised hand icon in WebEx. Again, we're all virtual today, so that should be easy to help facilitate. And then we will call on you. So with that, Lynn Erickson, if you would do the roll, please. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to state the name of your jurisdiction or agency if you could state your name. Also, another bonus about all virtual is that WebEx records you. So we will be able to capture everyone, even if there may be a few of you logging in late. Starting with the District of Columbia, DC Council Charles Allen. DC Council Christina Henderson.
Here.
DC Council Matt Fruman.
Catherine Miles attending for Councilmember Fruman.
Thank you. DC Department of Transportation. I see Mark Rollins on there. DC Office of Planning.
Rebecca Schwartzman, present.
Thank you. Moving on to Maryland, City of Bowie.
Present.
Thank you. Charles County.
Jason Groth, alternate.
Thanks, Jason. College Park.
Denise Mitchell, present.
Thank you. Frederick County. City of Frederick.
Kelly Russell, present.
Thanks, Kelly. City of Gaithersburg.
Neil Harris, virtually present.
Thanks, Neil. City of Greenbelt. City of Laurel. Montgomery County.
Corey Pitts, present.
Thanks, Corey. Anyone else from Montgomery County? Prince George's County.
Victor Weisberg, present.
Thanks, Vic. Anyone else from Prince George's County? Moving on to Rockville.
Present.
Thank you. Tacoma Park. Maryland Department of Transportation. Maryland House of Delegates.
Mark Corman, present.
Thanks, Mark. Maryland Senate. Okay, moving on to Virginia. City of Alexandria.
Kanik, present.
Thanks, Kanik. Arlington County. City of Fairfax.
Present, Tom Ross.
Thanks, Tom. Fairfax County.
Walter Alcorn, present.
Thanks, Walter. Falls Church.
Dave Snyder, present.
Thank you. Loudoun County.
Rob Donaldson, alternate, present.
Thanks, Rob. City of Manassas.
Pam Sabeski, present.
Thank you.
Ralph
City
Smith,
of
present.
Yep, got you too, Ralph. City of Manassas Park.
Jeanette Rischel here.
Thank you. Prince William County.
Alternate Megan Landis, present.
Thank you. Virginia Department of Transportation. Gotcha. Bill Cutler's present. Virginia House of Delegates. Virginia Senate, WMATA. Moving on to our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration.
Hey, David Schilling is here for FTA.
Thanks, David. Cool. National Capital Planning Commission,
Michael Weil, here for NCPC.
thank you. Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, and National Park Service. All right, that concludes the verbal roll call. However, we'll be monitoring the participant chat, and like I had mentioned, WebEx records everyone, so that's super helpful. That concludes roll call. We have a quorum.
Thanks so much, Lynn. We'll now move to the public comments. A copy of the comments received online have been made available to everyone. It's also on the meeting webpage. Lynn, would you mind summarizing the comments received?
No problem. Thanks, Chair Henderson. Between noon Tuesday, September 17th and noon Tuesday, October 15th, the TPB received 3 letters and 1 comment submitted via email. A summary as well as each comment can be found on our meeting webpage. I'll briefly summarize the comments now. George Tad Aburn provided a copy of a letter he submitted to the Climate, Energy, and Environmental Policy Committee back in September. The letter emphasizes the urgent need for CPC to provide advice to COG and the TPB on updating climate goals. The author criticizes CPC for not allowing public comments on the climate crisis issue during their meetings, suggesting that public input could have pushed for quicker action. He describes the current climate goals as outdated and insufficient. The letter urges CPC to adopt more aggressive targets similar to those of Montgomery County and the state of Maryland. The letter requests that CPC amend its agenda to prioritize defining a process for making formal recommendations to COG and TPB, highlighting the urgency of addressing climate change. Next, Virginia Delegate Mark Sickles writes that his legislative district runs along the I-495 corridor from the Springfield interchange to Richmond Highway. He references the Southside Express Lanes project underway to develop congestion remedies for this section, writing that the TPB's recent vote to include the I-495 Southside Express Lanes study in the air quality conformity analysis is a crucial step to complete the environmental analysis and will help make informed decisions to reduce congestion. He writes that the existing Woodrow Wilson Bridge was designed to accommodate future transit, including heavy rail, and VDOT's letter ensures that all study concepts incorporate rail preservation or include a commitment to convert future space. He states the existing express lanes support efficient bus service and carpooling, and continued studies are essential to enhance multimodal mobility and reduce congestion. He writes that if the air quality conformity analysis is favorable, he is hopeful that the project will advance with the goal to reduce congestion, improve travel reliability, and provide more travel choices along I-95 and 495. Next, George Tad Aburn wrote a second letter stating that during TPB's agenda item number 8 today, the TPB will receive a briefing on the final report on implementation considerations for the on-road transportation greenhouse gas reduction strategies. He writes that the strategy appears to be reasonable, but lags the strategies being adopted and implemented by some of the TPB members. He states that the TPB should require that the report language includes stipulating that the TPB does not condone or support any form of implementation of the on-road greenhouse gas reduction strategies that will create environmental justice problems or high-risk air pollution hotspots in communities of color. And he says that the COG board is considering more stringent regional climate change goals. Lastly, Bill Pugh writes that number 8 on the TPB's agenda today is a critical item. He writes that the board adopted a set of greenhouse gas reduction strategies over 2 years ago, and since then, TPB members have only advanced 2 of the 14. He states that the Coalition for Smarter Growth are disappointed that it has taken over 2 years to get this literature review to the board. He writes that the Visualize 2050 process has lacked accountability in reducing global warming pollution, despite the 2021 board resolution to do so, and asks the board to move forward promising greenhouse gas strategies that effectively address regional goals. A number of strategies are listed in his email. As I mentioned, all the comments are found on our meeting page. That concludes my report. Thank you, Chair Henderson.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions about the comments? All right, I don't see any. We'll move to the approval of the September 18th meeting minutes. We've been provided with a written summary of this, so I would trust that members have reviewed the minutes. I move that we adopt the minutes of the September 18th, 2024 meeting as provided. May I have a second to the motion?
So to the end result of that is that we had
Second,
minimal.
Denise Mitchell, College Park.
Thank you, Ms.
Uh,
Mitchell. Are there any corrections or additions to the meeting minutes? Okay, hearing none, we'll go to the vote. Are there any nays and abstentions from the District of Columbia? From Maryland? From Virginia?
Abstenting from voting on the minutes, please.
Okay, we will record that. That's Thomas Ross.
Correct.
Any abstentions or nays from the other agencies? Okay, thank you. The minutes are adopted. We'll now move on to the next item, which is the technical committee report. We have a written summary of the October 4th meeting, but we'll ask Amy Gabarini, who's the chair of the technical committee, if she could summarize the outcomes of that meeting for us. Amy?
Thank you, Chair Henderson, and good afternoon, everyone. Technical committee met Friday, October 4th, and the agenda was quite full this month, so the meeting summary found in your agenda packet will have more information, but I will briefly summarize. There was an update on the on-road transportation greenhouse gas reduction strategies, which sparked some really great discussion, along with updates on DMV moves and this fall's safety event, plus the establishing of TPB's new Regional Transportation Resilience Subcommittee. Additional informational items included a presentation on the draft 2024 Congestion Management Process Technical Report, a briefing on the motor vehicle characteristics in the metropolitan Washington area, which analyzed 2023 vehicle registration data and showed some interesting trends in the region. Lastly, an announcement for recruitment for the 2025 to 2026 cohort of TPB's Community Advisory Committee. That concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Does anyone have any questions for Amy? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much, Amy. We'll move on to item number 4, which is the Community Advisory Committee report. We have a written summary of the October 10th meeting, and I'll ask the chair of that committee, Ra Amin, to give us the highlights. Ra?
Good afternoon, TPP members. Audio check. Everyone can hear me okay here?
Yes, sir.
Wonderful, wonderful. Good afternoon, members. Thank you, Chair Henderson and Vice Chair Walkinshaw. The CAC meeting on October 10th included discussions on DMV moves, Visualize 2050, the 2023 Washington-Baltimore Air Passenger Survey, updates on the CAC recruitment, and the October 31st safety event. Highlights included the following. I briefed the members on the September 23rd task force meeting of DMV moves. Members discussed creating a small working group to spend more time on the details of the effort. We also discussed public involvement. We asked TPB staff to look into the possibility of potential co-sponsored events between the CAC and WMATA's community involvement committees. TPB staff provided updates on the TPB decisions regarding the Visualize 2050 plan, including the new schedule. Members look forward to working further with TPB staff on the public comment phase for the fully drafted plan. TPB staff presented findings on the 2023 Air Passenger Survey. Members appreciated the details on the passengers' characteristics and airport access trends, noting the survey's unique regional coordination and its use in airport planning. And lastly, during our local round Act Locally round robin, members shared their local community activities, including public safety improvements, walk audits, and transportation safety programming. I invite the TPB members to read the CAC report for more details about our discussion. This concludes my report.
Thank you, Ra. Does anyone have any questions for Ra? Okay, seeing none. Thank you so much, Ra. We'll now move on to number 5, which is the steering committee actions and report of the director. I'll turn to Conti for his report, which we have written. Conti?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. You have a copy of my written report, so I'll be brief and just review the contents here. Be happy to take questions on all of them. The TPB's steering committee met on October 4th and took the following actions. First, it approved requests from both the Maryland Department of Transportation and the Virginia Department of Transportation on changes to the functional classifications of a few of their roadways. These reclassification of roadways are allowed by the Federal Highway, and actually they are particularly called for when there is an update to the urban area boundaries like normally happens after a national census. The details of the roadways that were reclassified are on pages 5 through 15. The TPB amended or approved a few requests to amend the TIP. The first of those came from the District Department of Transportation. Through this amendment, DDOT proposes to add about $97 million for a set of bridge, transit, roadway, and bike projects. And this includes about $31 million in new funding for the multimodal safety project along Wheeler Road. The details are on pages 16 through 72. And then another amendment requested by Prince George's County, the steering committee approved a request to call out about $180,000 of the county's overall bridge program budget as related to personnel costs. And the last TIP amendment was requested by the Virginia Department of Transportation, in which it added about $2 million for the operations of a new express bus service on the Capital Beltway between Tysons, Virginia, and Bethesda in Maryland as part of the Virginia's I-495 Next project. Now, turning to the letters sent and received on page 79, the TPB provided letters supporting the Maryland Department of Transportation and the District Department of Transportation's applications for a federal grant under the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. Now turning to announcements and updates, which start on page 83. The TPB kicked off its recruitment for the next cohort of members of its Community Advisory Committee. Members might have seen a video that was produced a couple years ago. We request your help in getting the word around to attract members to serve on this committee. We do plan to bring the nominations back to the board in January for the board's nomination. The TPB staff will be hosting a webinar called Promoting Vibrant Communities and Safer Roads on November 13th. During this webinar, we plan to showcase and hear from the projects that have received grants from the TPB under the TPB's Transportation Land Use Connections Grant, the Regional Roadway Safety Program grants, and the Transit Within Reach programs. Between all of these programs, more than 200 such projects have been funded, and it'll be an excellent opportunity to learn from these projects about the opportunities to promote vibrant communities. Last month, since we were unable to share with the TPB the web page a new web page that has been created called the Transportation Resources Applications page, you now have a memo on page 84 that lists this website, which is a one-stop shop for various TPB products and the GIS tools that have been developed on a wide variety of topics, whether it is the equity emphasis areas, the high-capacity transit station areas, or the EV electric vehicle charging sites. I hope that members of the public and TPB member agency staffs find this one-stop shop useful. Also, some very exciting news to report, and that was the grand success of the 50th anniversary of the TPB's Commuter Connections event that was held at the National Press Club on October 2nd. Thank you very much, Chair Henderson, and you for emceeing the event, and Vice Chair Walkinshaw presenting the awards to a number of employers in our region. And also thanks to the Mayor of the District of Columbia, who provided a keynote address. It is truly a proud and historic moment for the TPB that over the past 50 years, the board has funded and implemented this travel demand management program. And it has been recognized as one of the premier programs in the country. Your staff has been invited to a number of national conferences to present, and we continue to innovate the program. And another good news, the EPA has approved revisions to the regional air quality emissions budget that were submitted by the state air agencies last year. With this approval, the TPB will now be able to use this newly approved emissions budget for the conformity analysis of Visualize 2050. Then staff also has provided on page 93 an informational memo that was requested of staff. And this was on the idea of, could we add one more scenario with a different set of projects for Visualize 2050's air quality conformity analysis? You can find the details of this on pages 93 through 94. And we also provide some background information on scenario analysis itself. What do those typically represent? The previous scenario analysis that the TPB has done, and certainly look forward to any new additional scenario analysis that the board might be interested in. And then lastly, and certainly not the least, COG is accepting nominations for the Bridge Builders Awards to be given out during its annual leadership meeting in December. You can find more information on this, and we seek your help in nominating leaders in your organizations or in your jurisdictions. You can find more information on this on page 97. That is all of the contents in my written report. One last item that is not part of the written report, and that is the Street Smart Safety campaign for the fall. Will be held on October 29th in Prince George's County at the Naylor Road Metro Rail Station. This kickoff will also be just 2 days before the TPB's October 31st Transportation Safety Summit, which is planned to be held in Alexandria, and there'll be more information about this later on in the agenda. That concludes my report, Madam Chair, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Kanti. Does anyone have any questions for Kanti?
Don't see any.
Okay. I don't believe there are, so I'm going to move on to the chairman's remarks. I trust that you all have a hold on your calendars for the TPB's Roadway Safety Forum on October 31st. Yes, it's on Halloween. I promise we will be done in time for you to get back to your homes to be able to provide that goodness to your community. This will be at a special location. It will be at the APTA Centennial Conference Center, which is next to the Crystal City Metro Station. This will be a luncheon event. It will start at 9 a.m. and then the lunch will be at noon. We will hear from a few subject matter experts on both the new and tested approaches to reduce roadway fatalities and serious injury crashes. And then importantly, the members of the TPB will brainstorm on ways in which the TPB can help address this urgent and serious issue. Just as a reminder for folks, our jurisdiction, our region, all adopted a Vision Zero goal, and we are nowhere close to meeting that at this point. In fact, every jurisdiction has had movement in the opposite direction. We'll have representatives from the U.S. Transportation Secretary's office, as well as from Johns Hopkins University. They'll have some new and innovative program ideas. I recognize that even though we are a regional planning body, we do not fund, design, or implement very specific projects or operate our particular roadways. However, I do feel as though it's important for us to provide policy priorities for transportation, and you all have a unique role to inform and affect the transportation investments and decisions and project selections that take place in your respective jurisdictions. 4 years ago, this board came together to create the Regional Roadway Safety Grants Program, where we provide technical assistance to our member agencies to work on roadway safety program projects. While this has been very helpful, each year the program is oversubscribed. The roadway safety outcomes are still far from being acceptable. Too many lives are being lost and too many people are suffering from serious injury as a result. This is not just in downtown, but it is everywhere in our region. And so I look forward to seeing you all on October 31st with your thinking caps on so we can collectively discuss how to address some of this issue. There's one more topic I wanted to address, which is DMV Moves. That is a joint initiative between COG and Metro. We, the TPB, are assisting both organizations in this important initiative. I will note that this is not just about Metro. It is about all of the transit systems in our region, and it's about finding a funding source that is both sustainable and predictable to meet the operating and capital needs of all of the transit systems. At the TPB, we are very, very aware of how critical transit is to meet our current and forecast travel needs for the region. And so many of the goals, as well as many of our goals around safety, mobility, accessibility, equity, and the environment. I, along with Charles Allen, Ruben Collins, and Mark Corman, are on the DMV Moves Task Force. So we are both part of the task force and members of TPB. This work has now reached an important stage where we talk about the unmet funding needs of all of our transit agencies and how to raise new revenue. So we will hear from COG's executive director on this a little bit later. We're all in various legislatures, and so we understand what it takes to raise new monies. But I encourage you all to please stay engaged in this particular issue, and more importantly, commit to our work together over the next year to ensure that we're able to continue service and make it more reliable and effective. So with that, we will move to the one action item of the meeting, which is the establishment of the TPB Regional Transportation Resiliency Subcommittee. We'll hear from our staff, Catherine Ranone, on a proposal to establish a new subcommittee working on transportation resiliency. After Catherine's briefing, I'll move a resolution R2-2025 and then seek a second. And then we'll discuss and then we'll take a vote. So Catherine, when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. You're always so good at saying my last name too, pronouncing it correctly. So thank you for that. I'm just waiting for the clicker. Thank you. So good afternoon, and thank you for just a few minutes today to talk about the newly formed Transportation Resilience Subcommittee, and then provide a very quick update on the work that we're going to be undertaking this fiscal year that the subcommittee will be a part of. This is just the objectives, very quick presentation today for your information. So as you may remember from the work undertaken in the past 18 months or so on the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, which I will refer to for the rest of the presentation as the TRIP, we had a working group that was on point, serving as the stakeholder engagement and technical advisory committee for this work. It was always a goal of ours to form a new subcommittee focused on the topic of transportation resilience once the formal working group relationship was sunset at the end of that project. So now that the TRIP is complete and has been formally approved by the Federal Highway Administration, we have set our sights on next steps, and one of which is setting up this subcommittee. The mission here is on this slide. I won't read it in full since you have access to these slides, and the resolution and other information in your packet if you want to take a closer look. But mainly the overarching mission of the group is to provide a forum and framework for the coordination of transportation resilience issues and planning at the regional scale, and to continue incorporating resilience into Visualize and the TIP. We are planning to start with resilience issues that are related to natural hazards and climate change, like we covered in the TRIP, but we may look into other types of resilience issues in the future, but for now, this is where we plan to start. So last slide was the mission. This slide shows the 4 main objectives that we aim to strive for with this new subcommittee. Now, I did workshop the mission and the objectives with the working group towards the end of the TRIP project, so this shouldn't be new to anyone who participated in that process. Similar to the mission of the subcommittee, the main objectives revolve around creating a space for regional planners to share information about resilience projects they're working on or thinking about starting, to collaborate on issues of regional significance, to help us at TPB decide on priority topics and issues for regional studies and analyses, and just generally expanding education on resilience and adaptation solutions across the region through presentations, workshops, sharing best practices, and more. This is just some information about the logistics of the subcommittee to start. We will be meeting once per quarter, with our first scheduled meeting to be held on November 14th from 2 to 4 p.m., which is a Thursday afternoon. Membership will be made up of representatives from TPB member jurisdictions, member agencies, regional transit agencies and authorities, and other regional planning organizations. Initial membership is made up of members of the working group who are interested in continuing the collaboration. But if you or anyone at your organization or locality is interested in joining the subcommittee or know someone who might be a good fit, please let me know. It is a great group so far. And like I said, we're only meeting once per quarter, so it's not a huge time commitment. And since I have your attention, I wanted to briefly mention a few of the things that the subcommittee will be hearing about and contributing to at our first meeting and over the course of the next year or so. One of the final sections of the trip was the future enhancements section, with a bunch of different projects that the working group and our team felt were important and wanted to continue looking into. 2 of which I'm excited to say we have already kicked off, and they're circled here on this list. Some additional interior flooding analysis and an economic impact analysis. During the first subcommittee meeting, we will receive presentations from our consultant teams on these 2 projects, updates on where we're at with them, and next steps for moving forward. And there will be plenty of space for committee members to provide input on various aspects of these projects to help guide their direction. That is all for my remarks today. I'm available for any questions or feedback, and thank you for your consideration on this resolution and this new subcommittee.
Thank you, Catherine. Just stick around for a minute. So first, I move that we adopt Resolution R2-2025. Is there a second?
Second, Snyder.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. Okay, are there any questions for Catherine about this subcommittee? Oh, Mr. Snyder, I see your hand.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would just like to underscore the importance of this work. We saw an initial report, and it has immediate import in terms of, if you can imagine, the kind of flash flooding that we're seeing and the potential loss of lives from people who drive through it. But it also has long-term significance for this region as we address the effects of climate change and other weather events. So I'm fully supportive of this, and since I'm supportive of it, I'm certainly willing to volunteer to participate in it. And I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank COG staff, and especially the staff involved in this, for starting this work stream. I think it could emerge rapidly as one of the most important positive things we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I will send you the meeting information, and I am happy to have you as a participant on the subcommittee. It's really awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else have any questions? Okay, so we'll move to the vote. I'll start with the District of Columbia. Are there any nays or abstentions? Maryland? Virginia? Other agencies? Okay, great. Thank you all. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Thank you.
thank you. We'll now move to item 8. And the next several items are just going to be informational. This number 8 is gracious. What are we doing? Implementation consideration for on-road transportation greenhouse gas reduction strategies. The final report. We have Michael Grant, who's with us. He's the Vice President of Transportation Practice at ICF Consulting. He'll brief us on the takeaways from the study that they conducted for us. Welcome, Michael. As he gets ready, Kanti, do you mind providing some context for this study and the briefing?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair. We are very pleased to have Michael join us and have concluded this study. As some earlier public comments alluded to, we have taken a little bit of time because, excuse me, we've been very deliberate about how we go about this. And the reason for that is in 2022, when the TPB completed its climate change mitigation study, and looked at, the study had identified 14 broad strategies. 7 of them were, in my view, this is my phraseology, were in the voluntary realm. And those all affected or have the potential to affect people's travel behavior and their mode choice, and thereby reducing VMT. And the TPB immediately adopted all 4 of them, all 7 of them as priority strategies. And we incorporated that into the framework for developing Visualize 2050. The 7 other broad strategies are what, once again, I would call are in the mandatory realm, meaning those would require some sort of policy enactment or legislative action at either the local level, state level, that sort of thing. So the TPB did say that we do see the potential of these additional strategies. The TPB also recognized that those sorts of higher level direct action strategies are what would very likely be needed for the region to achieve its greenhouse gas reduction goals. However, given that these are all policy and legislative actions, let us understand them a little bit more in terms of what are some of the factors to consider as we work together on advancing this, because these are not strategies that are well suited to be enacted individually at a local level, but this has to be collectively at a regional level. And if I may, and so that was the genesis of the staff budgeting some funding, procuring the assistance of ICF Consulting, that they have done this type of analysis throughout the country. And we engaged with them, and we started reviewing. While this was happening, there was some federal guidelines and new programs that the federal government had enacted. And we went back to the TPB's technical committee and said, apart from the 7 broad strategies that were identified back in 2022, are there other related types of strategies that you would want us to examine? And the TPB Technical Committee identified some more strategies. So this report has looked at all of those different strategies, and these would all be in the mandatory realm. And it covers land use, it covers travel behavior, and it covers vehicle. All of these are aimed at reducing vehicle miles traveled, and there are many different ways of achieving that end goal. So that is what this presentation is about, and I will turn it over to Michael, but I will close by saying I believe that the TPB member jurisdictions and the region as a whole has done quite a bit of work and is continuing to do quite a bit of work on all of these fronts, on land use, or its commitment to transit, or its commitment to travel demand management, as was evidenced by 50 years of commuter connections, the DMV moves as the commitment to transit. On land use, the regional activity centers. there's a lot that the region can celebrate on the success of these efforts. But as the TPB noted in 2022, there is still significant amount of work to be done. What has been done, in my view, might be considered the low-hanging fruits. But now, since more needs to be done, these are going to be tougher. These are strategies that we will all need to reach out to, and recognizing that these implementing these would need to be considering various pros and cons and intended consequences and certainly unintended consequences of this. And that's what we hope that the report informs us. And I see this not as an end, but the beginning of the next phase of higher level actions to help reduce greenhouse gases in our region. So, sorry, that went a little longer than I had planned, Ms. Henderson, but Michael, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kanti. Can you hear me fine and see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be presenting today on this important study, and am looking forward to questions and dialogue from the TPB, because this is a really important issue around greenhouse gas emissions and what strategies can be implemented and what are the implementation considerations around them. I do want to first thank the TPB staff, Mark Moran, Aaron Moreau, and Dushan Vuxan, who provided guidance to this effort, as well as staff at ICF, Noah Levine and Skylar Brown, who played a key role in the research. Move ahead this slide. So first, I'm going to provide very brief background on the study purpose and approach. Kanti provided a little bit of that, and then I'll highlight the findings. So as noted earlier, in 2022, the TPB adopted a resolution focused on the adoption of on-road greenhouse gas reduction goals and strategies. And as part of that resolution, the TPB adopted 7 priority greenhouse gas reduction strategies. These included improving walk and bike access to high-capacity transit stations, increasing walk-bike mode share, converting vehicles to clean fuels, deploying an EV charging network, adding housing near high-capacity transit stations and activity centers, reducing travel times on buses, and implementing transportation operations strategies. The TPB and its member jurisdictions have been advancing many of these strategies, such as through development of a regional electric vehicle implementation strategy. But at the same time, the resolution identified 7 additional strategies that were identified as potentially promising, but really required further exploration and research due to questions related to their implementation. And so this study was undertaken to examine those implementation considerations for the 7 strategies that were identified in the resolution for further exploration. In addition, as Kanti noted, based on input from the TPB's technical committee and ICF's review of recent carbon reduction strategy documents, climate action plans, and other research studies, we added 9 additional strategies to the study for exploration for a total of 16 strategies. And the study itself is designed to understand what are the implementation issues associated with these strategies, including the potential for greenhouse gas reduction, but also organizational and implementation issues like the authority to implement different policies, what levels of government would be involved, and the costs associated with implementation. So this slide shows the 7 strategies that were identified in the resolution for further exploration. These were generally identified or included within the climate change mitigation study of 2021 and showed potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, yet there were questions raised about how the strategies could be implemented and a desire to understand more about the implications of these strategies. So you can see these include things not just adding housing to activity centers, but shifting growth and development within the region, looking at free transit services, pricing workplace parking, converting more work trips to telework, even though we already have a fairly high share of that, and also implementing new fees based on vehicle miles traveled or a cordon fee that would be a fee going into major activity centers. Oops. In addition, as I noted, beyond the 7 strategies that were identified in the resolution, our team identified a set of additional strategies for exploration based on a review of different documents from the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as climate action plans of member jurisdictions. We also reviewed documents from many other states and national research to identify potentially promising strategies and gathered input from the TPB Technical Committee. And so you can see on this list, there are several pricing mechanisms, such as carbon pricing, pay-as-you-drive insurance, parking cash-out policies, where employers would pay essentially their employees not to take a parking space at work, and other incentives like for e-bike adoption. In addition, we looked at reducing VMT associated with school-based trips, which was identified as a potential strategy as part of the climate change mitigation study of 2021. And then the TPB Technical Committee actually identified several other strategies that we added to the list, 13 through 16, which included parking reforms, converting existing highway lanes to high occupancy toll lanes, and expanding microtransit and programs to incentivize carpooling and van hauling. I will note that the strategies were each assessed in a qualitative way in relation to implementation issues for state and local governments. These included the relative effectiveness at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the implementation issues associated with what organizations and legislative authority and enabling actions are needed to implement the strategies or policies, and the costs associated with implementation. In addition, we looked at implications on regional goals and priorities drawing from the TPB's policy framework. And this could be often co-benefits of these strategies, but also it could also involve potential unintended consequences we want to look at as well. Our methodology is based entirely on qualitative assessment, so I will note that. We did not conduct emissions modeling or use the regional travel forecasting model to analyze the greenhouse gas impacts of these strategies, but the assessments drew from various sources, including previous studies conducted for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments and the Transportation Planning Board, including the Long Range Plan Task Force and the Climate Change Mitigation Study that was previously conducted. In addition, we used a lot of other research studies, literature, case studies on the effectiveness of strategies, as well as information just to understand how these strategies could be implemented and what some of those implementation issues are. So now I'll get into the findings. And there's a lot of information on these slides, so feel free to later ask questions or if needed, stop me if needed. I will note here a key issue that we looked at first was the relationship of these strategies in terms of their greenhouse gas reduction potential and the time frame of impact. So on the chart on the right-hand side, you can see each of the 16 strategies that we explored listed. Some of these are abbreviated. So TOD stands for transit-oriented development, or the strategy that looked at shifting land use, shifting housing and employment towards more transit locations. We also look at that in relation to the relative impact on greenhouse gas emissions and assess that from a scale of low to high, and in terms of time frame of effectiveness from short term to long term. And you can see that through those symbols with the little clock symbols there. Based on this analysis, looking at the strategies that were assessed as high impact, so you can see those with the full covered circles there, we see many of those strategies that appear to have the largest impact or potential for the largest impact at reducing greenhouse gas emissions involve increasing the price of travel. So these include things like VMT fees, cordon pricing, and carbon pricing program. By providing a price disincentive for vehicle travel, these types of strategies generally provide a relatively immediate impact because people see that price and account for that in their decisions. However, we generally assess the time frame for those policies as medium, recognizing that there are quite a lot of logistical and coordination issues that go into establishing any of these pricing mechanisms. Most of these pricing strategies really have limited adoption to date in the United States and face many challenges, as you can see demonstrated by New York City's effort to implement a congestion pricing program, which involved years of planning but was recently put on pause by the governor. Looking also at a cap and trade or a carbon pricing program, that would require considerable coordination within the region and even potential and even broader. This would involve instituting a carbon tax based on the carbon content of fuels. We did note, and again, looking at what's been conducted so far, there is some experience with this in the sense that there was a regional program sort of spearheaded called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, or TCI, which was launched by a Declaration of Intent in 2010, and a coalition of states, including the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia, announced plans for a transportation sector cap and invest program in 2018, and then a draft MOU was outlined for a regional program in 2019. Despite this ongoing planning, only 3 states in the Northeast are in this overall coalition: Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia eventually signed the MOU in 2020. But by 2021, 2 of the participating states had withdrawn. In the United States, California and Washington State are the only states that currently have a cap and trade program addressing transportation. And the Washington program is currently on the November ballot, given political concerns raised around it. So that relates to pricing strategies. We also looked at, or are looking here at, the strategy of shifting development to high capacity transit stations and regional activity centers, or TOD. That was assessed as a high impact strategy as well. It's important to note, however, that these kinds of changes take time, and this transit-oriented development occurs through land development, and changes in development patterns will have important effects in the long term, such as through 2050, but when looking at 2030 goals at a regional scale, it has a much more limited impact. Finally, it's important to note that the greenhouse gas effects of strategies really depend heavily on how the strategies are implemented. And so particularly when we think about pricing strategies, you can imagine if you have a 50-cent per trip fee for entering a cordon zone versus a $5 fee, that would have a very different impact on travel behavior, as well as the revenues that would be raised. So the level of pricing and the level of incentives has a large impact on their overall effectiveness. There is also the question about the incremental effect that could occur from these policies, and telework is a case in point, given that we already in the region have relatively high levels of existing telework. Similarly, the region already has quite a few efforts focused on transit-oriented development and the planning of local jurisdictions around that. So the extent to which further changes would occur has some uncertainties. I will note here, again, still looking at the effectiveness at greenhouse gas emissions, we did look at the role of state and local agencies that they play in relation to these policies. And note that while state and local agencies do play a very important role in implementing these policies, and these could be through regulatory or policy direction, the impacts of many of the strategies still depend in some part on factors outside of the public agency's control. One example of this is with the pay-as-you-drive insurance policy concept. In concept, charging people for their insurance based on the miles they traveled provides a very strong incentive to reduce the amount of vehicle travel. And previous studies have estimated a reduction in passenger vehicle travel of 8 to 20% for pay-as-you-drive programs. It should be noted that these pay-as-you-drive is already legally available in the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. And the role of state agencies is really to regulate the vehicle insurance industry, is to regulate vehicle insurance. And so it's unlikely that a state can mandate pay-as-you-drive insurance, but there could be incentives offered for this type of insurance. And as an example, the state of Oregon previously did offer a $100 tax credit per pay-as-you-drive insurance policy. But ultimately, the impact of the policy depends not only on the effectiveness of that strategy of pay-as-you-drive, but on the extent to which government policy influences the insurance companies to offer more appealing pay-as-you-drive insurance policies and the pricing structure of those policies in a way that would incentivize reduced driving. We did note that similarly, policies related to workplace parking pricing, parking cash out, and parking reforms can be advanced, as we see in the District of Columbia, where they have a parking cash out law, but they do require a lot of coordination and consideration of the private sector, and there's a role for the private sector in implementing each of those policies. So although the strategies are generally implementable at the state or local scales, we also did note that to be most effective, many of these policies require considerable coordination across state and regional boundaries. As an example, the city of Alexandria currently offers fare-free bus services, and so it is possible to offer fare-free transit on an individual basis, but to do this at a regional scale, fare-free service for transit would require very significant discussions among jurisdictions regarding funding for transit. As we see, with the DMV Moves effort, but this would go even further in terms of looking at fare-free transit and implications on funding. Even strategies that in theory could be implemented relatively quickly, like pricing strategies and conversion of existing lanes, often do require considerable planning, public processes, and interagency coordination. One example is converting existing lanes to hot lanes is not as simple as just restriping those lanes on the roadway or putting in a policy. It would require potentially considerable transportation investment for entry and exit points to the toll lanes, environmental reviews, and federal approval, since imposing tolls on federal aid highways is generally prohibited under federal law without certain exceptions. Looking at the costs of these policies, you can see there's a table here that shows an assessment of revenues and expenditures associated with each of these policies and the fiscal impacts. So on the chart on the right, you can see the assessed impacts on revenues and expenditures for the public sector, as well as for the private sector, which includes private companies and freight shippers, and on households and individuals. When we look at the public sector, the costliest strategies likely would be the fare-free transit services due to the loss of the fare box revenue. Yet, many of them have some other costs associated with them. And the pricing strategies, on the other hand, would be net revenue generators. So that revenue could be utilized to support some of the other strategies. For the private sector, most of the strategies pose relatively negligible cost, but there are some fees that would be paid by businesses and freight shippers. And for households, we see that pricing policies generally would add some direct cost onto households, although the impact depends on the program design. In general, policies that result in reduced VMT would result in some reductions of associated externalities and potential health costs. Also, the way the program is designed and the way the revenues are used with different types of programs that could sort of have policies for credits for low-income communities, and others would have an impact on that as well. And then in the long term, some of the pricing mechanisms could reduce some costs for households if households are able to give up private vehicle ownership by using e-bikes, microtransit, or other transit services. Looking at the regional goals, and I'll wrap up shortly, just want to note that the chart on the right shows each of the 16 strategies assessed in relation to these regional goals and priorities, such as accessibility, environmental quality, equity, and safety. We assessed each of these qualitatively as having either a positive impact on these goals, a negative impact, uncertain, or negligible in cases where impacts are likely to be small in the context of other policies and factors. It's somewhat difficult to conduct this assessment, I will say, because the impacts of these policies depend heavily on how the strategies are implemented. For instance, the pricing strategies, which are strategies 4, 6, 7, 8, and 14, do each raise some potential equity concerns when you're thinking about additional costs onto households and the ability of low-income persons to pay those costs. On the other hand, the programs can be structured to enhance equity, such as through toll credits, rebates to low-income households, and use of the revenues to pay for enhanced transit services. We'll note that by reducing vehicle travel, all of the strategies should have a beneficial impact on air quality and public health and environmental quality. So there are a lot of co-benefits to these strategies. I will say that, however, there is some uncertainty regarding the conversion of general use lanes to hot lanes due to the potential increases in traffic congestion and diversion based on taking existing lanes capacity away. The strategies also generally will have beneficial impacts on other goals like safety, reliability, and efficiency. However, many of these impacts are relatively small or uncertain, with some exceptions. And for instance, an individual that reduces VMT by shifting from driving to transit or telework reduces his or her individual risk of getting into a car accident. However, from a regional perspective, we saw during the pandemic that while VMT declined, fatalities on the roadway system actually increased due to more reckless driving. So as a result, we generally considered the impacts of some of these strategies as uncertain or negligible from a regional perspective, but recognizing that many factors go into traffic safety. And strategies such as e-bike incentives, there could be potential increase in bike safety incidents. So a lot of uncertainty around this. But I will just sort of wrap up as a key takeaway of the assessment is that some of the most effective approaches likely would pair what we consider sticks or disincentives to driving with what might be considered carrots or strategies that expand or enhance or incentivize using transit, rideshare, bicycling, walking, or telework. The pricing policies would disincentivize driving, yet the other policies would provide more options to the public, which could in turn address affordability and equity concerns. For instance, again, looking at tolling existing general use highway lanes, that could lead to additional traffic congestion, as I noted, in general use lanes. But if additional policies to provide carpool and vanpool incentives and extensive investments in transit are implemented, those kinds of policies could ultimately provide high benefits and address those concerns. With that, I'll take questions. I will note that a lot of these strategies, as I noted, do have co-benefits, and there's a lot to consider in terms of the implementation around these strategies. So with that, happy to take questions, or I think, Conti, if you wanted to also just engage some dialogue about where we go with this study, that's
Thanks, Michael.
Be of interest.
We have a couple of people who already have raised their hands. I don't know if you can see that in the chat, but
no, I'm sorry.
no, it's okay. Folks are engaged. So
Michael,
we'll start with
if
Eric.
you could Michael can stop sharing so we can see. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, that would be better.
We'll start with Eric Olson.
You, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Yeah, this is obviously there's a lot here to digest and to consider. I think this is some of the most important stuff that we can work on, frankly. I guess I want to ask about next steps. I'm not sure who that would be directed to, but certainly staff and chair. Next steps here. How do we, develop consensus? How do we? I mean, I think we're a regional body. There's a lot of issues here that we all, I'm sure, are very have done some work on, but obviously regionally we need to do more to advance these. How do we get to the point where we can start implementing this more? Can we get a plan, for how we approach that? I'm not saying a plan to implement, but a plan to get to a plan to implement. Obviously, not all these things are going to be done overnight. Not all of them are going to be done, period, probably. But there's a lot here to consider and to, look at the pros and cons. I mean, there's a lot of things here that are going to be difficult. There are a lot of things that there may be some low hanging fruit, but there's a lot of things that we can do in the short term, medium term, and then look at long term. So let me pause there and see if we can staff maybe to develop some kind of a report back to us in the not too distant future about how we can start working on this.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Olson. This is Kanti. I'm happy to share my thoughts on next steps. We felt that the first order of business for staff was to meet the board's request to bring back a set of considerations towards implementing any of these strategies. And we hope that this report has given us enough to think about, to chew on, and to work on. In terms of next steps, one of the comments that we have received is, hey, this report did not recommend anything. And that was intentional. These are policy actions. It is not for staff or for a consultant to advise what policy should be enacted without having the full spectrum and appreciation of the pros and cons, and particularly of legislating or policy enactment. Speaking on that theme, my thought is we can certainly work with the executive committee of the board this year, next year. And one thought that comes to my mind is holding a series of work sessions for the board members, because these all require enacting policies or legislation. So we could start there with a sense of which jurisdiction might be willing to proceed on some of these things. And Michael, during his presentation, and it's in the report as well, has acknowledged some places where things are already being done. The District of Columbia was mentioned, for example, as having some programs in place. So there's an opportunity in these work sessions to learn from other jurisdictions what they have already enacted, even if it is not in the fullest extent of what is envisioned here. But if it is moving in that direction, there are opportunities to discuss how did they go about. Many of these things at the end of the day are going to require community support, community buy-in. So we can work with that, facilitate those conversations, and as an outcome of those conversations, if there is more information that is needed to be collected or analyzed or things like that, staff could certainly work that into our work program. So, Ms. Henderson, I'm sorry I took over to give that response, so maybe I should have deferred to you, but that's just my thought.
Thanks, Kanti. Eric, did that address your question?
Thank you. Well, I'd love for us to have a little bit more of a, timeline, when are we going to get something back in terms of how we approach this? And I mean, it's going to take a lot of discussion. I understand that, but I don't want it to, wait a year or 6 months or 2 years or whatever it is. I think that it's important that we look at this and tackle these issues as we can as a region. And it's difficult. That's why anyway, so maybe staff can come back to us. Well, I'm not going to suggest exactly what we should do, but if staff could come back to us with some recommendations for a process.
Sure.
I don't know, Madam Chair.
Oh, someone else said.
No, I said certainly we'll be able to come back with some thoughts.
Okay. Eric,
Thank you.
I agree with you. I don't think you're incorrect. I do feel like this will be a lot of work, and we've been having these conversations with the staff as we especially look towards the roadway safety summit. For me, this issue is super important, and I feel like the TPB continues to have these conversations, and yet the jurisdictions aren't acting. And so we need to figure out a way of how do we actually take this information and this data that Michael and his team have put together to actually move the needle forward. Neil?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, thanks to the consulting company and to TPB for putting the study together. There's a lot of great information. Of course, I'm going to ask for more. First of all, a couple of things. One thing that I find difficult is understanding what the fiscal impact of these are. We have $1 sign, $2 signs, $3 signs, but I don't know if that means, I mean, that's a useful rubric if you're going to a restaurant and want to know if their meal is going to cost $20 or $200. But I think in some cases we're talking about many billions of dollars, and I think that would be very important information to have an actual dollar number or range for these projects. A column that would be useful to add, and I know this is difficult, but going along with the discussion of the fact that many of these programs have moved forward to be implemented only to be canceled at the last minute by New York or put on a ballot is the current state of consumer acceptability or voter acceptability for these kinds of projects. If we're going to just go out and charge people a lot of money for doing things that don't cost them a lot today, I think we're likely to get a little bit of pushback for that. So we need to understand what the key issues are from a voter point of view. And this is a democracy. We don't live in a dictatorship, at least not this month. So we really need to understand that. And then finally, a couple of things that aren't on here that I would love to see on here, given that I'm from Gaithersburg, where we don't really have a lot of high capacity transit since Metro stops right before the city limits. And unfortunately, the only mass transit we really have is MARC, which is great, but it only runs a few times a day. Expanding the high capacity transit network, both in terms of frequency and in terms of reach. And being personally, my day job is either brings me to offices in Herndon or Columbia, neither of which is reasonably accessible from transit from where I sit. So working on, if we want people to get out of their cars and into transit, we need to make sure that there are viable transit options for them. And finally, looking at on a similar subject, where we talk a lot about transit-oriented development, but I'm wondering if there's a way to look at development-oriented transit. For example, here in Gaithersburg, we've just approved the plan to redevelop the defunct Lake Forest Mall and add 1,600 much-needed housing units to our inventory. And there are multiple projects that are cropping up in the area that will be coming before us to add hundreds of more housing units. It would be great if, as these communities continue to expand, if we expanded transit access as well. And I know as we go north from Gaithersburg into other growing communities, they would like better options as well. So I'd like to see TPB really explore what it takes to meet the needs of the growing population as we move farther into the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Does anyone else have any questions or thoughts on a particular? I do have a question for Michael. I don't know if this is kind of an inappropriate question to ask, but nonetheless, you guys were the ones who were doing the study. Was there anything that surprised you all about what you found?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure, but I do think that some of the policies that appear to have the most impact, like some of the pricing policies and others, I think maybe it's not surprising, but are some of the most difficult things to get public acceptance around. And so there also are a lot of strategies that I think are relatively low cost, like the, potentially e-bike incentives and others that seem easier to implement. Yet they probably have relatively small impacts on a system-wide scale compared to something like road pricing. So I don't know that that's surprising at all, but I do think it's useful to think there are a lot of incremental things that can be done, but there is a challenged to getting to really dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and really making significant change, and recognize that it takes some time to get there. So maybe that's a takeaway.
Thanks for that. Appreciate that. Mayor Ashton?
Thank you. I want to echo the comments of my colleagues before me. I won't repeat, but it did strike me that, like, yes, we can implement road-based pricing. However, to the comments of my colleague, Councilmember Harris, if we don't have the transit set up, then we're really just looking at a revenue tool, not actually getting people off the roads. So that is something to consider. I also know that there are places where we have transit, and I've spoken to business owners who said, my employees are racing out the door because the last bus is at 8:45 and we have night shifts. So, where we have transit, is it functional for the workforce is something that we also need to look at, because people do work at night and we need them to work at night, but we need to give them, places and a reliable, timely transportation to make that happen. The question I have is relating to impact. How did you measure impact? Because the e-bike incentive was interesting and intriguing to me. I have been looking at other cities where it's becoming more of a way that people are traversing, and they like the motorized bike, not motorized, but that it's not as hard to bike with an e-bike. So it makes it more accessible for different people in different capabilities. But it doesn't have a high impact piece here. So I was just curious as to how you measured the impact. I also am interested in looking at, okay, how can we prioritize these strategies and then maybe track ourselves over time so that we can move from plan to implementation?
Well, I will note we did not conduct modeling or use the regional travel model to actually assess in the region, like direct numbers in terms of impact on greenhouse gases or VMT. So we relied largely on literature and examples from other places in the country. And I think so far we've seen, like for the e-bike, some good experience in a few places where there is some increase in use of e-bikes, and there is potential given the number of short trips that people take, but we sort of had generally more qualitative assessments based on the research and assessed that as relatively low, just given the different types of markets that often use e-bikes, the length of trips and other issues like that. But I wouldn't say there was a sign. We didn't get down to actual how many millions of VMT would be reduced from each policy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Ashton. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to item 9. Which is an update on DMV moves. We have been joined by Clark Mercer, who is COG's Executive Director. He'll share with us the status and his perspective on where the DMV moves initiative is at this particular stage. Clark?
Okay, thank you, Chair Henderson. And thumbs up here. People are good. Sound? Okay. You need to get up and stretch a little bit. We're on the back end of this meeting, it looks like. But I'm excited to give you this update, and it complements much of the discussion from the previous presentation. Hoping to accomplish 3 things, and then obviously take questions, comments, feedback from you all on DMV Moves. Kind of what is DMV Moves and what is the goal of the effort, and then looking at 2 big buckets of what DMV Moves is all about. One is how can we improve coordination and efficiency of our transit system writ large in the region, with Metro obviously being a big portion of that, but also all of our other transit providers, bus providers, MARC and VRE. And then secondary, how do we pay for the transit system that we want in this region? The slide deck I will cover if we go to the next slide here, but I will not read off of each slide here. So DMV Moves is comprised of 2 working groups and a task force. The task force are elected officials from the COG board and WMATA board members. We have the executive and legislative branches covered in the district in Maryland and Virginia. And we've got a Maryland, Virginia, DC, and federal rep from the WMATA board. So that's the DMV Moves Task Force. There are 2 working groups that meet a little bit more often than the task force and help bubble up good ideas, thoughts, and feedback to the task force. One is our Government Partners Group. That is chaired by Brian Hill, the Chief Administrative Officer of Fairfax County. And that includes your Chief Administrative Officers from the entire region, your CFOs, and your transit operators, as well as transit groups like NVTC. The other working group is a Community Partners Group, and that is chaired by Jack McDougall, who's the chair of the Washington Board of Trade. And that includes different environmental groups, your business groups, your unions and labor groups, your passenger advocacy committees, including from TPB, large employers in the region. And the goal for both of these work groups is to make sure that everyone that has a voice or an interest, which obviously a lot of folks, a lot of groups, but be as inclusive as possible and make sure folks have a seat at the table and are able to offer their input and feedback on this process. Because at the end of the day, and I'll touch on some comments that were made at the previous presentation, we intend to put a series of actionable recommendations before the task force, and then by extension, the WMATA board and the COG board and your respective board of supervisors and city councils. And we don't want anyone to say, I did not have the ability to offer input or insight into this process. Doesn't mean everyone will agree with every recommendation, but we do want folks to have visibility into the process and be able to weigh in. So let's go to the next slide and go over what the vision and goals for DMV Moves is. This is anyone that's been on a board of a nonprofit or a council. The visioning statement took a bit of time, but it was really important before we get to talking about money and how much it costs to run a system. We need to define what we want out of that system. You can't really articulate what something costs until you define what that what is. And so the DMV Moves vision is that transit is the backbone of an integrated world-class mobility network that makes the National Capital Region a thriving global economy, a preferred home, and a leader in innovation, environmental sustainability, and social equity. And as articulated in the last presentation, we have a lot of goals in this region that the TPB has weighed in on, that the COG board has voted, your respective councils, and we can't accomplish a lot of these goals without a thriving transit system in the region, whether it's economic development, attracting and retaining companies to this region. If folks can't move around and get back and forth to where they need to get to, they won't locate here. From an equity standpoint, and Mayor Ashton, I'll comment on your comment earlier about folks being able to travel when they need to travel, whether it's for work or whether it's for play or recreation. That's an equity component. Certainly from an environmental standpoint, we have aggressive goals in this region for lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and we're not going to be able to do that unless we have a thriving and well-run transit system, kind of full stop, period on that. And it's helpful for me just to think about, in the 1990s, we had 3 million people in this region. We have 6 million now, and we're going to add 1.5 million in the next 20 years. And if you look at our roadways now, we are back to pre-pandemic or above pre-pandemic levels of traffic and congestion. Think about adding 1.5 million folks to this region and how they're going to get around. If we're going to continue to be the economic power horse for Maryland and the district and Virginia, we have to have a thriving transit system. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the goals there, I'm not going to read through each of them, but they complement many of the things that we just talked about in the previous presentation, and priorities that each of you have articulated from your respective dioceses in your home jurisdictions. Let's go to the next slide, and this will be helpful to talk about some of the areas. This is the survey. We'll do survey first, and then we'll talk about recommendations. So we have a survey that TPB put together for us, and I should kind of say from the start, this has been a ingrained effort with Conti and Eric and Pierre and the TPB folks here at COG work on this project. And we have a full survey, the crosstabs, and all the information you want to dive into coming out soon. And Conti will get that sent out to you. But the top line from over 5,000 respondents, I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone, that over 80% of respondents support more and better transit service, even if it requires higher investment by the region. On the bus side, main challenges of bus service is not frequent enough, too many transfers, and lack of real-time information. Top priorities being more frequent off-peak and late-night services, more thought being given and more bus-only lanes so folks can move around in the bus if they're taking it, and new transit connections and routes. On the rail side, the rail stops are too far away from home and our destination, not frequent enough, and the priorities being more frequent off-peak and late-night service, new transit connections, routes, and longer operating hours. I will also say this brings up the obvious point. We are partnering with all of the transit operators in this region, Metro being one that provides over 85% of the transit services. And an initial conversation was had with the leadership of WMATA, and the task force is co-chaired by WMATA board member Paul Smedberg and the COG board chair, Mr. Charles Allen. And with WMATA's leadership and their CEO, the conversation from my seat here at COG was we need to partner with you, but we need some commitments. One, we need a commitment for kind of full engagement from the WMATA team in this effort, full transparency if there's questions being asked about finances or aspects of service or plans that WMATA has on the shelf. And obviously, we need an exceptionally well-run and safe metro system as a foundational underpinning for any discussion that we're going to have about funding needs. And I will say WMATA has been a terrific partner. We have some really smart folks on the task force, on the working groups. The working groups and task forces they're facilitated by Nuria Fernandez, who ran the Federal Transit Administration for the last 3 years. She ran several very large transit systems in the US. And then Nick Donahue, who many of you know, he works with folks in Maryland, and he was a deputy secretary of Virginia for 8 years. But projects like Long Bridge and the rail acquisition work in Virginia wouldn't have happened without Nick's work and collaboration with folks in this region. So we've got the right folks at the table asking questions. When we flagged things for WMATA or early on, we said, hey, for example, fare evasion comes up, right, as an issue. It's something you need to be mindful of and focus on. They have been responsive. Fare evasion is down by over 80% on the rail side. And I know that the WMATA board is discussing on the bus side how to account for that in the funding formula. They have not shied away from having difficult conversations with us. And I just want to make sure that I say that. So this slide here encompasses 6 buckets of recommendations that are not going to be new to anyone on this call that has partaken in a WMATA or transit study in this region before. And one of the first things we did to help inform our board members, task force members, was we compiled, and all this information is available on the DMV Moves website, which you can easily get to through the COG homepage, was we put together a compilation of every recommendation that had been made on how to make WMATA and transit more efficient in this region, from every kind of serious report that's been issued, from TPB, from COG, from the Board of Trade, from Smart Growth Coalition, and ask the question to the staff, and this gets to a comment that was made earlier, how do we take some of these recommendations and actually implement them and move this discussion forward in a meaningful way? And the question has been asked, are these recommendations still hold water? Do they still make sense? And if they do, why have they not been implemented in the last 30 years if they have been recommended time after time in this region? And one of the reasons that I am convinced some of these recommendations have not been implemented is because regardless of what group was constituted to come together as a special task force and issue a set of recommendations, the recommendations stay at a fairly high level. And the recommendations are the last thing that the respective group makes, and then it dissolves. And the region is left looking at one another wondering, well, geez, I wonder what exactly that recommendation means. Who is supposed to implement it? What is the incentive or deterrent if we don't participate in its implementation? And then we do sometimes what we're good at doing in the region is kind of pointing at one another and moving on to the next challenge or emergency. So the charge from Chair Allen and Chair Smedberg to our staff and consultants has been, let's take some of these high level recommendations, which I'm going to talk about in some detail in a moment. But we want you to come back to the task force while it's still constituted, while we still have elected officials at the table. And we want you to give us a roadmap for exactly how we're going to implement these recommendations. Who takes ownership of this recommendation? Are there legislative hurdles in the way at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level? Are these recommendations that can be unilaterally implemented by WMATA and its board? And we want you to spell out chapter and verse how we're going to implement. It's ultimately up to our elected officials to take those votes. It is not, as Conti mentioned earlier, it's not the staff's job to take the votes on those policies, but it is our job to present and tee up to our elected officials a well thought out game plan for how to get from concept to implementation. So on the customer experience and improvements recommendations, integrating and align fare policies to provide a consistent customer experience. And this was spoken to at the last presentation about going fare free across the region. We have some systems that, and they're not fare free, obviously, the taxpayers of those jurisdictions pay to run the bus systems, but you don't pay on the bus itself. We have different pay policies for students, where students ride free or a discount. We have different fare policies for senior citizens. We have different transfer policies throughout this region. And it is much easier to get in your car and drive around this region and understand what you need to pay and how you get from point A to point B than it is to take a bus and transfer to a train and to get on Metro. So this and some of these discrepancies in fare policies play themselves out. You may have a jurisdiction that is going fare free on their bus service, while at the same time advocating to Metro that they need to raise their fares in order to help address their budget shortfall. So on one hand, you're saying fare free is the policy, and the next, you're saying that an entity needs to raise its fares. So we're trying in this discussion to bring some semblance of consistency so that customers know how to get around this region, maybe establishing a ceiling above which you can't go for a bus fare. And then on a couple of those different groups I mentioned, children and seniors, and then also our deeply discounted policy for individuals that qualify, making that consistent. Certainly not telling any one bus system or WMATA what all your fares have to be, but for some of these groups, to the extent that we can make them consistent, that is a very consistent piece of feedback from our community partners group. That we need to look to try to align fare policy. The second bucket is adopted shared service guidelines for when and how often transit operates and measure performance. So this one really, really important to note from the outset that we've got a dozen bus operators and WMATA, and nobody's going to tell anyone exactly when and how often you need to operate a bus route. This would be a guidelines to aspire to for different types of bus routes. So particularly the bus routes that are really heavily traveled, where you know you have a lot of people riding buses, kind of how often they should operate. Part of the Better Bus redesign a couple of years ago was kind of a scorecard for different bus routes, where you look at where you grade different aspects of your bus service. And that is something that is ready to flip the switch and be implemented. There has been a little hesitation from some of the providers perhaps to do that from funding. So we're looking at a way to capture funding, but we need to be able, and you as elected officials need to be able to measure apples to apples how our bus service is doing throughout the region. And that does not mean every bus route is treated the exact same. There's more rural jurisdictions areas that you're going to have, for whatever reason, a bus route with far less people that travel on it, but is strategic for your county. That is captured here and recognized, but a way that we can have a table at which all of our bus providers gather and have a way to compare bus routes across the region and make sure that the ones that are really critical are being given the support, the funding, and the kind of road treatments that you would expect for those highly trafficked bus routes. The third recommendation, improve wayfinding, customer information, and amenities at transit stops. So this is one, think of when you go to National Airport and you are pulling up into Terminal A or B, you see 20 different airlines. Each one has its own logo, its own color scheme, but it's on a sign that is orderly and makes sense. So this is not a recommendation that says everyone's going to get new color schemes, it's all going to be the same, and our buses are all going to be the same color. It is trying, and there's some great diagrams that articulate this. We're trying to avoid that bus stop that has 7 different signs, numbers of bus routes that there's really no rhyme or reason for what they are, and it's really difficult for the customer to figure out how to get around this region. Amenities at transit stops. When you have an extra dollar to assign and you are debating and discussing in your local county or city where you should put it on a bus stop, this would be a guidebook, and I underline the word guide, to say these are the type of bus stops, kind of getting up to the recommendation above, where more people are traveling. This is the kind of setup for a bus stop that would accommodate more people versus one that is not traveled as much. And then obviously some of our wayfinding apps that are not terribly easy to negotiate. The last recommendation for customer experience and improvements is implementing bus priority strategies. And that is things like bus lanes, dedicated bus lanes in areas where you have the highest trafficked buses. And I will say for this last one, there's other types of road treatments and signage that you can assign. The bus lane is probably the best example. And this really requires the cooperation and partnership with our departments of transportation and our localities. So our VDOTs, our DDOTs, our MDOTs. And in talking recently with one of the directors, regional directors, there's got to be a methodology here that's transparent, that everyone agrees on, that says, look, on this handful of lanes where we know folks are traveling, lots of people are traveling, and they're getting stuck in traffic, they're sitting, making it wasting time, wasting money, bad for the environment, all the things we've talked about. We would be willing to work with this regional transit initiative to treat those lanes. It can't be an open-ended process where every lane's going to go to a bus-only lane, right? Or you're putting that on roadways that just don't merit that type of consideration. But if we can get a semblance of agreement from our departments of transportation, this would be important as we look at things like bus lanes and BRT throughout the region. On the second side, the right side of this, is administrative and cost efficiencies. So group procurements, we do this at the Council of Governments. Many of you ride off of contracts that we have. We buy things like bottled water, diesel fuel, road salt for the entire region. Widgets that everyone is buying. It helps drive down the cost if we can buy those things in bulk. Now, things that are specific for transit agencies, obviously something that would come to mind would be buses. Right now, we have our dozen bus companies and WMATA purchasing different buses. There's a discussion going on. Once you start kind of adding, just when you go to the dealership and purchase a car and you want this amenity, you want that amenity, we start differentiating the buses in this system so that you can't do those kind of group procurements. And oftentimes the city will go and look outside this region that maybe they can find another entity that is buying the particular bus that they have in their respective jurisdictions. We can drive down the cost by looking to procure things like buses, looking to do things like store our buses in the same depot, looking to do things like joint maintenance and operation. Many of our bus providers have a maintenance and operation contract. for folks to work and fix the vehicles. We pay through the Metro formula a fair amount of money to have really talented engineers who repair buses every day. Can there be a discussion about doing a joint effort for maintenance and operations? When a bus breaks down on a road, there are many of our bus operators that have their own independent contract for recovery towing services. Many times it's a road that has multiple bus operators and they have multiple contracts on that road. So there are areas where we can be more responsible stewards of tax dollars. And that's going to be important as we talk about the significant funding need for our transit agencies, that we're doing everything we can to bring costs down. The last bullet there is making training, certification, and inspection programs more consistent. You know, this is one of those things I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anybody. Over the years, different requirements have been added particularly to WMATA, whether it's by Virginia or by the district or by Maryland, and we don't necessarily coordinate those requirements. So for example, WMATA undergoes, I think it's half a dozen audits at least every year. The Commonwealth of Virginia requires an audit that looks at a certain measures things a certain way. Maryland requires a different audit that measures the same kind of thing, but differently. And the district requires one that looks a certain way. The feds require one. Could we bring in International Auditing Association and suggest one audit standard that's the highest standard possible, but one audit so that we can save time and money? If you're an elevator technician for WMATA, you have to get trained and certified in Virginia on one set of standards, in the district on a set of standards, in Maryland on a set of standards. We talk a lot about public safety with WMATA. You have to get certified and trained. It takes a year to certify and train a public safety officer for WMATA, because you have to be certified and trained to standards in Virginia, to Maryland, and to the district. So this is kind of a catch-all. You know, as we look to, and everyone talks about bus drivers and the shortages here, but being trained to one set of standards that you can drive a bus in Frederick County or in Gaithersburg or in Arlington or the district or for WMATA would be one workforce type of alignment goal that would make this a more attractive region to come and work in. Let's go to the next slide, please. So you see what topics are kind of under development now and being discussed. I just went through many of those, and then future topics include things like the transit supported land use and system coverage and expansion. Next slide, please. Okay, so the funding piece of this conversation is one that is well, depending on where you sit, it's either already heated up or it's heating up for folks. WMATA faces a funding issue that is not dissimilar from every other major metro system in the country. And I want to say that from the outset. There are some unique things that have happened in this region which make this more challenging that I will cover, but I want to make sure folks understand that the New York, Chicago's, Boston, San Francisco's are all facing a funding crisis of sorts, and they're all trying to figure out how to close a gap to operate what they have now. And so on the left-hand side here, we talk about what the expenditures are for our transit system writ large. And this includes MARC and VRE and our bus systems throughout the region. But what does it cost to provide existing service and pay for the projects we've committed to? What does it cost to make sure that we're paying for the existing state of good repair? We do not want to go back to where we were a decade ago with safety issues, particularly on our rail line. How are we accounting for increases that came about through the pandemic and through inflation? And then what folks like to talk about, and we just heard about it the last presentation, how do we expand our transit network? How do we maximize our service, modernize it, and get it to more people that need it when they need it? On the revenue side here, you know, fares and advertising account for some of the money that comes in for our transit. State provides operating dollars, our localities operating capital. You have seen all of this before. A couple of the items that I would just want to make sure I remind folks. The region stepped up in a big way last year to help for WMATA reset their base. And when I say reset the base, that's the basic bill that is sent to Virginia, Maryland, and DC to run WMATA. And it was reset, and it had to be reset for a couple different reasons. And I know this is repetitive from some folks on this meeting. It might not be for everybody. But during COVID, when a lot of federal dollars were coming into the region and coming into localities, into WMATA, WMATA, working with localities, decided to, rightfully so at the time, pause their billing to the localities and states because of the federal dollars that they had coming to them. They then picked their billing back up a few years later. WMATA is limited to what it can increase a bill from year to year. So because it paused it, and that pause lasted for a few years, there was a substantial lag in kind of what WMATA needed to bill to catch back up for basic expenses. And this is that 3% cap each year with exceptions. So that was one big reason and unique thing of why the base needed to be reset for WMATA. And number two, just like all of your jurisdictions, inflation was a significant driver of WMATA's costs, heavily capital intensive on the rail side, and obviously it's a people business. 70% of their money on operating is tied to personnel. So between inflation, that pause on their on how they do assign dues to the states, and then obviously a loss in ridership due to COVID, there was a resetting of the baseline last year. Also, on that slide under revenues, we had the state of good repair money, and that was in 2018, where the states and the feds came together in a big time way, and I worked with many of you when I was in Richmond on this, and it was a compromise. It was a divided legislature in Richmond, and one of the compromises in order to get that new money was that it would not be indexed. So that 500 million in 2018 was not indexed to inflation. And I don't think anyone has to be a treasury or economic expert to understand that that money has far less buying power in 2024 than it did 6 years ago. The last aspect to this slide, which is a little complicated, and we'll get to the next one in a moment, that I want to make sure folks understand is that while the region stepped up in a big way last year to reset that baseline, we didn't step up all the way because we just couldn't, given where budgets were last year for everybody. So WMATA has moved a significant amount of money from their capital program into their operating program in order to run the system that it needs to run. Every metro system in the country uses some percentage of their capital funds on operating. That is a normal business practice. But they use a de minimis or small amount of their capital to shift it to operating. Metro has been forced to shift a significant amount, between $100 and $200 million a year, of capital money into operating. And what that does is that state of good repair, that money that we dedicated in 2018 to make sure that Metro is safe and reliable for everybody, they can't bond any new projects on state of good repair in a few years. They run out of that money, and they pay only debt on what they've obligated. And so Metro did that as a short-term 2-year budget move, recognizing that the bill for that move is gonna come due soon. Next slide, please. So far we have discussed on this slide scenarios 1 and 2, and they build on each other. So if you want to get to expansion of Metro's rail system, or a major expansion of their bus system, or a major expansion of BRT, You got to make sure you're paying for existing service and baseline of state of good repair. That's scenario one. You got to make sure you're also paying for scenario two, which is enhancing kind of the service that we have now, increasing bus, increasing some rail, not new rail lines, but increasing the existing rail that we have. And you got to do scenario three, which is modernizing service and modernizing assets. Let me give you an example on, it sits somewhere between scenario 2 and 3. The switches and the signaling infrastructure that Metro has is 40 years old. This is kind of basic infrastructure that signals to trains when they go, when they stop, where they should go, that sort of thing. It's like a necessity for any metro system to have. That is like a multi-billion-dollar replacement that Metro is going to need to make. I think that sits in scenario 2. Others might argue that it sits in scenario 3, but I bring their signaling up as an example. Before we can even get to talking about expansion of the rail system, there are billions of dollars of state of good repair and investments needed on the existing services. So scenario 1 and 2, we are looking at above and beyond the readjusted base. That readjusted base is assumed it will be readjusted and go into the future. We're talking about another 800 million to possibly 1 billion, 600 million to 1 billion a year, every year for WMATA, plus what we need for our bus operators throughout the region. And those numbers are consistent with our major metros throughout the country. So it is a significant amount of funding that the region will need to come up with. And we are, as a task force and working groups, making sure everyone understands the scope of this issue, make sure they understand Metro's budget. If there are questions that CFOs or CAOs have, Metro is sitting down and going through their own numbers so folks can understand it. Metro just approved a CBA last month, perhaps. It included 0% pay raise for union and non-union staff this year, which is pretty impressive. I don't think many of us have organizations where there's a 0% pay raise this year for folks. And then in the out years, it's anywhere from 3 to a ceiling of 5% for their staff. So they're doing what they can do to rein in costs. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this one is just a summary slide that obviously takes all of the different entities listed to achieve this outcome, which is a strong transit system, an excellent transit system for the region. Next slide, please. And then this is what we are getting into, and I should caution, say we are getting into a discussion with Maryland, Virginia, the district, and the feds. What are different taxes that can be looked at? What are different mechanisms that might be looked at to raise the revenue that is needed? Some revenue sources grow, some are more unaffected than others by downturns in the economy. Some, like a fuel tax, does not have a great growth rate out there. I will say sales tax is one that you hear often because it's one that is generally used in many transit systems and has a pretty steady income flow. Discussions are not only going to be had about what types of taxes or fees might need to be looked at, but how they should be looked at as a region. The more hands that a tax touches or goes through provides more risks to the market and to banks, and you're not able to bond nearly as efficiently and stretch your dollars further. So dedicated, you hear the term dedicated tax, that would have a more direct path to flow toward transit agencies and to Metro, is something that is preferred because that gives a steady and predictable flow of money that's unencumbered by more legislative bodies. If a tax is raised and has to go to the General Assembly in Maryland and Virginia each year and get debated, and then it may make its way to Metro, it is harder to bond a source of money like that. So there's discussion being had and will become more robust as to whether it's even possible to entertain one tax or a combination of taxes for this region to generate the monies needed? Or would Maryland, the district in Virginia, prefer to get the bill each year and figure out on its own how to pay it and make sure that it's paid? And that is a discussion that our elected leadership will obviously have at the local level, but very importantly with their partners. And I saw some of our delegates and senators are on this call with legislative and executive leadership in DC, Annapolis, and in Richmond. Next slide, please. And so this is the task force schedule. And again, I'll wrap up, and I'm sorry if I've trespassed on your time and gone over. But the goal here is to return a set of actionable recommendations on how we can be more efficient and coordinate as a region, and also get a funding scenario before our elected leadership then voted on while this task force is still constituted. That's it. That's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Clark. So we have about 5 minutes left in the meeting. Does anyone have any quick questions? You got to use the scan feature, so I'm not going to be able to see. Okay. Well, no one has any burning questions for right now, but Clark, appreciate that review and presentation. I'm sure there will be more discussion about what's coming out of DMV moves in the next few months here as we move forward. As we wrap up today, I just want to, again, we're going to have a real quick review of the Roadway Safety Forum by Janie on the TPB staff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. This is just a very brief update that we have continued with our planning activities for the October 31st Safety Summit, which will take place at the APTA Centennial Center in Alexandria, Virginia. And since last month, we have received commitments from several speakers, as you had noted earlier, Madam Chair, for the events. So we'll be releasing the finalized agenda very soon. In addition, invitations have been sent to board members and alternates, and registration is now open. Our plan is to offer a virtual option to participants, and we recommend that interested participants, regardless of whether they plan to participate virtually or in person, please register. If you have any questions, my colleague Andrew Meese and I would be happy to answer any of those questions, and that concludes my announcement.
You're muted, Ms. Henderson.
Just kidding. Thank you. Thank you, Janie. As she said, I look forward to seeing you all at the event in a couple of weeks. I want to thank you all of our presenters today, and thank you for everyone for engaging. We have no further business, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.